I definitely lean more towards the poverty gospel. I think that is in part a reaction to like the prosperity gospel.
Generosity is central, not incidental to being formed by Jesus. How has that been ringing true for you in your life?
I feel like it helps me relate with God more because God is an abundant God and he wants to give us blessings. When I give, it feels good to give. So when I do that and I realize like, oh, this is actually like, it feels good to do this. Why would God want to like hold back from giving me blessings? I can see how it can be difficult, especially if you have never tithed. You're living off of 100% and you're used to that lifestyle to then cut 10% of that off.
Yeah.
That can be a big shift for sure. I still would consider myself frugal, and I think that's a big reason why I haven't gotten into like coffee, that we mentioned earlier, is because I'm like, it's expensive.
So do you notice frugal has turned into a negative word? You know, like some people are like, oh, you're so frugal. The root word of frugal actually means fruitful.
I like to think of like, there's an old Spencer that is a different person than me, and I'm trying to take care of him today.
I'm so excited for today because we finally are in that portion of the practice where we're going to be interviewing people about how they're engaging with the practice of generosity. We've been doing this on our YouTube channel since February of 2023. In fact, Spencer Heaton is our guest, and this is your second time.
Yeah, long-time listener, second-time caller.
And your story was, first of all, ironically, as our sound guy, this wasn't your fault, was the worst audio of all of our interviews because you guys were sharing a mic, you and Emily.
Yep, I was the sound guy at that point, but not of this studio.
No, it's entirely me.
Yeah.
Which is why we now do headphones, so we can see if you can even hear us at all. So we pivoted. We don't do couple interviews even anymore because we just don't have enough mics. Yeah. I think that's half of the problem.
So if we got one more mic, we'd be fine.
And one more camera? You see the problem? Or do we just sit really close to each other and just a wide angle?
We'll figure it out eventually.
So Spencer is also our video guy, photography guy. There's a lot of website guy.
Yeah, I do a lot of things.
You do a lot of things. So thanks for coming on. For those, you know what? I don't like jumping right in until the music's done. Can they even hear the music?
Vibe.
Can they even hear? I feel like one time I did this, the last time, and you could barely hear it. And Heather's like, where's the music? And I was like, oh no. So now they're probably hearing it for the first time.
So now we just vibe to it.
Now we vibe. I think it's a vibey song, you know?
It is.
It is. No, I'm really excited for this. The hard thing about these generosity stories is, of course, Jesus talks about don't let your left hand know what your right is doing. And so what's been hard is to get people to share, because inherently, and you have this humility, I don't want to talk about how great I'm doing in this practice, because then it feels like it defeats the purpose. It's almost like you're doing this for the wrong reasons. And so for the listener, I want to disarm those comments. Everybody we're going to be interviewing for this practice has not been begging me to do this interview. I've been saying, hey, I just know your life enough. I think this is a great opportunity to have these discussions. So I'm excited about that. We have a few more on deck. But I will say this is the weirdest one of all the practices, specifically because of how private it seems to be. And this also, it's a little too loud for me.
A little bit.
A little loud.
I wasn't going to say anything.
I will say, there was this one time where I was with my youth pastor. So I was like 17. We were driving from New Mexico to Arizona, and we saw a hitchhiker, and we're like, let's pick him up. And so we go to pick him up, and he's like, hey, he was actually like, I'm actually walking on the road to share the gospel to people. So we're like, oh, wow. Okay. So then we heard about that, and they're like, are you Christian? And we're like, yes. So they're like, I don't want you to pick me up. Keep going. I'm just doing this to have conversations, which like, dude, this was the middle of nowhere. He had no plan B. It's pretty incredible. But then we said, can we pray for you? And he said, no. You're not in a closet. This is not private. On the Sermon on the Mount, it says to pray in secret. And so I think there's a way to take that too far. I don't think there would have been anything wrong with us to pray over him, but he said no, so we couldn't. So that's why I think there's a balance with that thing on the Sermon on the Mount about being I think the hardest and best way to give is to be secretive, but there's moments for us to help the congregation to just talk about the practice a little bit more publicly. So, first of all, Spencer Heaton, who are you?
Yeah, just a guy that was from California. I moved to Arizona. It's been a while now, and I just kind of stayed here. Been coming to Passion Creek for 3 years now, I think.
Is that it?
I think so. It's
I feel like the
3.5.
turn of the new year it'll be 4, right?
Yeah, in March, I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so found out about it because I was doing marketing stuff, and I came across Brady Shearer, and he does a bunch of marketing stuff, and he highlighted you guys, and I was like, maybe I should try that one out. And you guys were still at the theater at that time.
Yeah.
And so came to visit thinking I could hide and just like observe. And 2 seconds in, I get, "Hi, I'm Trey." And then I didn't come to Passion Creek for another little bit.
Scared you away.
But eventually came back and got involved. And yeah, now I do like the sound is kind of my primary thing, help with setup. I also have a video background, so I adjust the camera in the back and stuff. Almost knocked it down this past weekend.
That was fun.
Yeah, I got a little scared there.
Not to mention, it was already a crazy morning.
Yep. So for those listening, my feet got caught up in the scuba drape. And I tripped and almost knocked down the tripod. Thankfully, it didn't fall. I'm fine. Everything was fine.
Do you forgive me? Because all I said was, "Is the camera okay?"
Yep, that was your first thing. I figured he sees that I'm standing, and I was like looking at the camera.
Yeah.
And then you asked that
You
question.
didn't look like you were in trouble.
So yeah, I was like, I was asking that question myself. So we're good.
Yeah. The camera's still working, obviously. So we double dip on using these cameras throughout the week too. So yeah, that's great. So you're a Dodger fan, so it's a great week, great month for you.
It's been amazing.
Yes.
It's just
Notice
such a
how
good feeling.
I pulled back from making fun of you the second gathering.
Yeah,
so.
First service, I was put on blast. I texted Emily because she was teaching the kids the Christmas stuff. I texted her. I was like, "Trey's picking on me. I can't do this alone. Come on."
That's too funny. Well, first of all, so Emily usually gets my notes, my manuscript. I didn't send it to her this week because I was tweaking all the way up to it. And I never planned those terrible jokes. So she wouldn't have been able to warn you anyways. It's not like I would ever put Spencer Dodger comment,
Fair enough. Is it like, did you like see me in the corner of your eye and you're like, this is where I'm going with this, like off the cuff kind of thing? Or so if I had been in the back still, do you think you would have used that joke?
Definitely because I saw you.
Okay.
No, because I don't want you to not sit up close. So you know what it was?
I'm going to be as far back as I possibly can, which is where the sound booth is. But I have to go be below the sound booth.
Yeah. All right, let's transition.
Moving on,
because I was about to do a whole thing about beat LA. I believe in it, mainly for the Lakers, though. So my hate doesn't extend to the Dodgers too much. So,
Fair enough.
Anyways. Let's talk about generosity. So for those who are listening, there's kind of two different ways that we organized this practice of generosity. First, we're throwing the message titles. So we talked about how we're here to make disciples, not donors, an abundance, not scarcity mentality. And then we talked about stewards, not owners. And then we end with tithing, not tipping. And so I think that was a good way to kind of contrast the two different ways, or all the different ways we can view giving and not giving. And then the definition, the working theory that we have is the practice of generosity is living like disciples who trust in the God of abundance by giving like stewards who tithe to God's kingdom. So those are just as a refresh, especially if you've heard those teachings before, we're going to dive into this just topic of giving. And one thing I have noticed in talking to people, I've actually found a lot of people are kind of quickly convinced I should give. Now, I haven't really had too many discussions, percentage and all of that, and I'm comfortable with people like just working that out on their own, so I'm not bothered by that. But one thing I have heard constantly is they don't have their money together, so it's hard. So their heart wants to give, but at the end of the month, they're like, I have no money. So that is one reason I would love for you. I think just off of, we've done life enough together. We do stuff outside of church. just random little things pop up where I'm like, this guy budgets. This guy thinks through this. And so I'd love to even know your story behind that, how that started. But the first official question is, what are some practical ways you've put generosity into your budget?
It's literally putting generosity into the budget.
I love how simple.
Yeah, it's just as simple as that. Obviously we have our tithe portion of our budget, but we also have, and it's not like a huge piece of our budget, but we do have like an extra giving piece. And that's simply because we realize like there are people like would come up, or opportunities would come up,
Yeah.
to where it's like, we want to give to that, but we don't have, like, every dollar has been given a job already. So we can't give to that. But then we were like, well, let's make some of our money, like the job is extra giving. So we have a portion for that, so that when those opportunities arise, we can be like, oh yeah, sure, we have that. We can give easily, because we know that's already, we made that decision before the opportunity arrived.
So do you do these budgets by month, and let's say an opportunity didn't arrive in the month of October? Does it roll over, or are you like, no, I need to give this to somebody because every dollar has, what would you say? Every dollar has
its own job.
Yeah.
I think that's like a Dave Ramsey thing. So
Yeah.
if it sounds familiar, that's where it's from. But yeah, if I actually kind of like when we don't use it all in one month, because then it does roll over to the next month, and it's like, oh, we have an opportunity to give even more if somebody, really has a thing that they need. So yeah, we always make sure that it rolls over to the next month.
Right on. How do you budget? Have you always been budgeting? Like, I'm telling you, this is if we did 5 weeks in the generosity practice, it would have been budgeting 101, because it's such a hard thing. And I think people get really intimidated to start it. But I found in my own life, the first month's hard, but then all of a sudden you just get in this rhythm and you just kind of learn it. But talk about budgeting, just all of this. Think about the person who has never budgeted ever. What advice do you have?
I feel like it started when I was young. I remember getting like a piggy bank from my parents, not a literal pig, but it was like, it had like different buildings. It had church, had the bank,
Wow,
and it had like the house. And it was kind of that whole idea of like, okay, 10% goes to the church, like 20% goes to the bank, and then 80% you get to spend wherever you want. Percentages might change a little bit, but it had that kind of distribution.
bank meaning savings.
Yeah. So we had that kind of idea was ingrained young, I think. But I wasn't making a ton of money as a kid. We didn't really even get allowance.
Faith with much, though, right?
So if I found $1 or a quarter on the road, I'd be like, oh, I found a quarter. How am I going to split this up between the 3 buildings? I don't know how. But it wasn't until college that I really had like a spreadsheet. And it was also really simple. I literally did okay, I'm going to save 10%, and then another 10% I need to, use for all these costs. And then the other 80% was just whatever. So it started out really, really simple spreadsheet. And then I found out about Every Dollar, which is Dave Ramsey's budgeting platform and his app. And so that was really useful, and really got to break down everything by little piece by little piece. So you have food and non-foods and all those things.
And so convenient because it ties to your account. So it kind of says, which category is this? We're going to start putting them in those places.
Exactly. So I think at that point is kind of when I really got to like personal finance and want to listen to podcasts and stuff. So I kind of just really, it's kind of almost like a hobby to me. I enjoy it, which I know not everybody enjoys it. So I'm like, oh, that's a gift that I'm able to enjoy that.
Sure.
But then I found out about YNAB, which is You Need a Budget, which is what I currently use to budget everything. And that's really, really nice. But I feel like it's also if you really like budgeting, then you're going to love it. But if you don't, then it might be confusing at first.
So I've used both, and Every Dollar was easier to me.
It's simpler for sure. But just what you can do with YNAB.
Yeah.
I just love it. So, But yeah, it doesn't have to be
for the person
complicated.
who's even more interested in this. There's free versions and cost versions to both, right?
I believe so. I'm not 100% sure with YNAB. I know for a fact with every dollar there's a free version. But yeah, I've gotten to a point where it's kind of complicated, but it just starts out pretty simple. You know what you're going to be spending on, or you have an idea of what you want to spend on for every different category in your life. And then you just assign numbers, and then at the end of the month, it's probably going to look a little different than what you expected it to look like.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of figure that out as you go on. So the first month is going to be
better
weird.
And better.
Yeah, you're going to hone it in a little bit more. And it helps you realize like, oh, I just made like a, like off the cuff kind of spending decision, and it threw off my budget. And you get to realize that. And so then you realize that when you actually are spending things and you're not thinking about, that's another $10 or another $5. You really think, I don't think that's in my budget here, so I'm going to think about it differently.
Even what you just said, $5 to $10, people don't think in those increments. They think of the $1,000 purchase. But
yeah,
if
everything,
you do the $5 purchase, 200 times or whatever, right?
Everything creeps up like a lot. I like to think of it almost like a subscription too.
Yes.
I don't drink coffee. I've been blessed to not need it at this point in my life.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think about it like if you're doing a coffee every day and it's, at a coffee shop, $5 or something like that, times 30, that's like, you have like $150 subscription. The math probably
12.
did not, I don't think that math actually worked out.
Yeah.
Maybe it did. But it's just like, that's expensive over time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just in 1 month. Yeah. And then you said like times 12, and then you realize, that is in the thousands of dollars. And you just don't think about it when it's just $5. But when you can put it into a spreadsheet and kind of have that personal finance and have that like 30,000 foot view, you're able to identify these things.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Oh man. I've even heard that you've helped people in our church, like kind of start that budget. What do you have like 1 or 2 or 3 tips to get started? Like, have you noticed obstacles that people have in getting that budget going? I know one thing is like telling them it will be depressing at first, but there's freedom at the end. So like keep going, but anything else?
Well, I think it's also like a time thing. Cause it is like, it's probably an hour or more to kind of like sit down and try to figure everything out. And if you don't know where to start, then
do you do that every single month for an hour, or is it more now just kind of plug and chug? You just keep checking it.
I usually try. My ideal is like every week I kind of go down and, just make sure, balance the checkbook kind of thing, but with the budget. I don't always do that, but at the end of the month, I want to make sure that everything is clean and see like, okay, we overspent in this category, so that we're going to take it from this category and, make sure everything's balanced, and still makes sense. And then if we're like, okay, we need to really cut down on this, so I want that to be at least a monthly basis. But I try every week to kind of do that, but it does take some time to do that.
Yeah.
But when you're first starting out, that it's intimidating, because it's like, okay, everything I spend money on, I have to think about all those things. And so just trying to simplify it as much as possible. Get all your accounts together, where do you spend all the money, what checking accounts, savings accounts, credit cards, and all that stuff. And then just put it into kind of basic categories, like food, non-foods, bills, subscriptions, all those things. And there's plenty of templates.
Apps. There's apps where that like doesn't Rocket Money or whatever they're called. They're literally like their pitch to join is like, you have subscriptions you have no idea about. We'll help you find out what those are. Like that's how unorganized we are.
Which to me, I've always been like, wait, what?
Yeah.
There are subscriptions that you don't know about. You're not paying attention.
Yeah.
Because like for me, if there's something like reoccurring that's coming out, I'm like, this needs to get going out of here. Or, if I don't recognize it, I'm like, I'm calling the bank and being like, hey, you guys overcharged me or something. I don't recognize this transaction. So that's kind of just how I am.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just get everything in order, maybe even if that's like the first step that you do, is the first day is just making sure like you have all the accounts in order and everything's, categorized.
Yeah.
And then you can kind of make decisions later, but like split it up a little bit. That might be helpful.
I think one thing that's great in the conversation about money is I think it really is, it's a good example of what, practicing the way life looks like. It requires intentionality. I think it requires discipline. It requires you to say no to certain desires, right? Like, and the rewards. And I love that idea of money, the compound interest, like how it all of a sudden just rockets up. One of the best things I did was I had a retirement fund at the age of 20. Like I started putting into it. And like when you see the math about like, if you isn't it like even 20 versus 25, it's like insane, the trajectory difference, because of compound, like it's just such a powerful principle.
Yeah. Compound interest is incredible. There's a resource, they're called the Money Guy. And they're kind of like Dave Ramsey, but like they are okay with credit cards as long as you use them well. And they have a whole guide called the Financial Order of Operations. That's incredible. And so basically it just kind of helps you know, like, okay, if I've accomplished this thing, what should I go to the next? And then so forth. It's like 9 steps. But they talk about compound interest, and I think it's like, if you're in your 20s, like $1 saved and put into a retirement account to allow that compound interest, it's like 88 times what it will be like when you retire. So $1 equals $88 really, if you save it in your 20s, and it gets, lower and lower as you age.
Yeah.
But it's still like kind of crazy amounts when you think about it, like multiple times of what it would be if you just save it.
And I think the principle behind that is, even all of these practices, we might not see, success right away. Like somebody who's Sabbathing for a year. I don't know if I'm that restful. I still feel anxious, which, by the way, I think the ultimate thing is just obedience to God and giving him that day. But there's always, these side benefits. I'm assuming, like, I am on this trajectory where I'm not, all these practices we're engaging in, I am not judging them how they're operating in my life now. I'm thinking about who I'll be when I retire. And I just can't imagine the compound of that. I think that's a few decades from now is really when the fruit comes. Us being in the Industrial Revolution, post that era, we think machinery, we think just like come up with the product and print it out en masse. And I just love that Jesus's parables is all about gardening and creation. And like, it takes forever for a tree to truly be all that it's supposed to be. And there's seasons and it's slow growth, but that's the healthy growth with the deep roots. And I just think money has a great way of communicating that as well.
Yeah, completely agree. I feel like a lot of the practices, I kind of think about it with that compound interest, kind of like what you were bringing up. Just like, I just need to do this thing today. Just need to start. So like when I go back to like scripture reading, I feel like this is kind of a thing that I feel like a lot of people do, is like, I get into a season where I'm in the Word every single day. I'm studying. I'm really taking the time. Yeah. I'm spending an hour and it's study and I'm going deep. And then it's like, I missed a day. And then I missed another day and another day. And it's just like, you kind of fall off a cliff and you're like, now I'm in a season where I'm not doing anything. And I feel like this year, my whole thing is just like, okay, read a chapter a day.
Show up.
Just need to show up. And I've been able to do that every day. I haven't gotten into like, I'm studying for an hour or anything, but I've shown up every day.
Yeah.
Which is going to be huge if I can ingrain that habit. And then I go a little bit deeper every year, a little bit by a little bit. It's going to pay dividends in the end.
Yeah. And I say this to people to encourage them, not to discourage them, because I think my biggest battle since I was 13 to about 28, my biggest battle for 15 years was become consistent in my devotional time. Because as a pastor, I have to differentiate. Like when I'm studying this morning, Acts chapter 20, it's weird. Like that is study time and it is fruitful for me, but it's also a little bit of a job, like I have to go like, no, I'm reading. So I read Haggai this morning as well. That was my devotional time. It's not rushed. I'm not thinking, how do I turn this into a sermon? So for 15 years, it was like devotional time where I'm spending at least 15 minutes. And now it's so second nature. It's easy. And like, I used to not want to tell people that because that sounds braggadocious, or people say you're a pastor. Of course it's easy. I'm like, no, the devotional time, talk to any pastor. It's actually really hard because you're trying to separate those two worlds. But I'm like, no, but it took 15 years and now it's, it's that overnight success thing. So just keep going. James Clear, have you ever read Atomic Habits?
I haven't. I want to.
Yeah. We're kind of dancing around these principles right now. Why not? Why wouldn't you? Also what?
Because I'm not as much of a reader as I want to be.
Nice. I assume you're just this deep reader. I don't know why I think that.
I listen to a lot of podcasts.
That helps. That's another substitute. But he says it's the Galatian principle where in Galatians 6:9, do not grow weary in doing good, for at the proper time, if you do not give up, you will reap a harvest. So that's biblical language. You reap what you sow. Mm-hmm. His language was nothing is ever wasted. It's only stored. So like so it's compound, right? So like that chapter, that's not wasted. Like that's stored. You may not see the benefit of that, just a chapter a day. But then when you look back, a year from now, 10 years from now, all of a sudden you have a huge wealth, to tap into. So I love these principles we're tapping into. Because of time, we have a lot more questions. Is there anything else you wanted to add? Nope. To that? Okay, wonderful. What obstacles have you had to overcome in order to practice generosity in your daily life? Which daily? That's a bit difficult. Is it just your life or maybe
every single day? I feel like the biggest thing is just a fear of like the future and fear like of the unknown.
The abundance, not scarcity.
Yeah.
Talk.
So like, for example, I'd like to have a family someday, and I hear that those cost money. And so I'm currently living in a way that I don't have a family yet, don't have any kids. And so it's like, okay, my life is going to change when that happens. Not only will I have to like pay for another human being to, help them survive and such. My time is going to be constrained. My wife isn't going to be able to do exactly what she's able to bring in at this point. So it's just like all these factors of like, I don't know exactly what that looks like. And that is scary. And so it can kind of, make me have, like, I want to hold on to this stuff. I want to save as much as possible because there's going to be emergencies and such. And I don't think that's necessarily bad, that instinct. But if you make it so that you're shunning everybody else and not helping anybody else, that's when it can become dangerous and not helpful.
It's that Luke 12 parable that Jesus gave, right? It's like that the guy who's like, man, I have so much wealth, I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger ones. It's like, okay, you're storing it up just to store it up. You've kind of missed the plot line. But also you see in the Proverbs, the person who saves and who is prudent and doesn't, the wasteful spender is the one on the side of the road. Like that's what you're dancing around. You have to balance both of those.
Yeah, there's such a, like, in the Christian life, there's so much stuff that's like, it's what's your heart posture on this? And thankfully, God knows the heart posture of everything. So it's not like you can trick him, and be like, oh no, I did this thing. And he's like, well, you did it wrong. Like the whole time, like I could tell.
Like the Pharisees who gave a tenth, but didn't care about people
exactly.
at all.
You had it for your own selfish gain. And so when it feels like, oh, I have to save everything, and that can go down a bad road. But then that feeling can make us not save, which is a good thing as well. So it's trying to figure out that.
I think it's also because I'm realizing. So you're actually a great example of somebody who I love your story because it's like, hey, I didn't wait till I found myself in a mess and then I figured out how to budget. You had great parents who said, here is a piggy bank that has a picture of a church, and like that's incredible. So I'm thinking parents are encouraged by this story because they're thinking, man, I'm just going to instill these principles now. Then they don't have to deal with the things I dealt with. I know for me, generosity has always been easy because my dad modeled generosity always. Like it was always a way of life. It was never a question. He wasn't as much of a saver. So that's some part of my story. But all that to say, I want to make sure, because I remember going through a season where I didn't want to listen to Dave Ramsey because I felt so condemned. You know, like I'm not anywhere close to where I need to be. And the irony was, I was like, I don't want to listen to it at all, which actually put me eventually into an even worse position. You know, so with all these practices, I'm always trying to remember it's all grace. There's forgiveness. You can totally take steps back. You know, you can move forward still. Because I was talking to someone else in our congregation where they did a similar thing where they actually spent most of their 20s, all of their 20s, this person. He didn't give me permission, so I'm going to be vague about this person, but they spent it saving, and they didn't have kids yet, you know, and they did debt-free, this, that, the other, found themselves in a good spot, and now they're starting to have children. And I think that's wonderful. That's great. That's not what I did. So for our story, I got married at 21, my first child at 23, off of a youth pastor salary that would not be able to pay rent anywhere in California. Just thankfully I lived on the college campus, you know? So I actually, for a long time, like just paying the bare minimum on debt and barely making it in life. But what a joy having a child, you know? So like, I've never looked at my child as like, oh, I'm poor because of you, you know? So now I'm realizing our having children stage is done. And actually the stage where this can be misinterpreted, but children require more time when they're like little, you know, like they're just, it's all consuming. They're now at a season where they don't drain me, you know? So like I am able to be wiser and I'm able to actually get creative by making money on the side and all of that. All that to say, I'm now in that season where I'm like aggressively paying off debt as much as I can. But I feel like it's actually because it's the only time I've been able to, because of how I set my life up. I don't think my way is wrong. I don't think your way is wrong. Right. So that's why I bring all this up, because I think the person could be listening and thinking like, oh, well, I didn't get a retirement fund in my 20s and now I'm 45, you know, like, but anyways, I love your story. What a great example that you don't have to screw up to learn these lessons. You know, was there something though I'm pivoting. Was there something in your childhood that actually introduced scarcity mentality? Was there something, and maybe this is too deep and I apologize, but you know, like, did you see wasteful spending around you and that's why you were like, I'm not going to do that? Or was it like, this is a great example, I'm just going to keep living the way that these people around me are living?
I'm going to answer that question. And this might be an editing thing. Could you turn down my headphones a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. Just a little bit.
Wait, it's this one. Go ahead and talk.
Okay, so I think that sounds a little bit better for me. Go ahead and you try talking.
Check.
Okay, that sounds a lot better.
All right, good.
I'm so sorry to do that to you.
No, you're good.
Okay, do you want to like ask that question?
No,
again,
this is
we're just keep going.
Normal raw podcast. Go for it.
Cool. So yeah, I like going back to my youth. I think it was like the 2008 financial crisis that actually kind of had a little bit of an impact on like how I viewed money. And it still kind of affects me today. Because like my parents, they had a rental house and the 2008 financial crisis happened and they like lost the house. And it's not like we had to like move out of our own house or anything, but I kind of sensed the like effects of that stuff happening. And so whenever we like went out to a restaurant, and I still kind of do this today, I'll like scan for the lowest, like the cheapest item on the menu and be like, do I actually want that? I'll like try to find the cheapest version of the thing that I'll like.
Nice. On
the menu. And that's just like, I don't want them to like spend a ton of money. Like I know that we're out here trying to, you know, enjoy this time, but, I just kind of had a frugality like mindset from that point on. And that kind of continued, you know, into today. I still would consider myself frugal. And I think that's a big reason why I haven't gotten into like coffee, that we mentioned earlier, is because I'm like, it's expensive. And I could just drink a thing of water and hopefully that helps me stay awake. I don't know. But yeah, so I've just kind of have had that frugal mindset growing up, and I think that's a kind of where it started.
So do you notice frugal has turned into a negative word? You know, like some people are like, oh, you're so frugal. The root word of frugal actually means fruitful. It actually means that like you are
It's a good thing.
Yeah.
It's a good thing, everyone.
Yeah, and of course there's a negative version, but to be frugal is to say, I want all of my life to bear fruit. I don't want to be wasteful. I want it to count and to matter. And I won't give away our 2025 theme, but that's essentially it, to live like this fruitful life. Frugal would be a lot harder on the marketing side to say, hey, be frugal, but that's what it is. Okay, was there any other obstacles? So it's this scarcity mentality, which again, there is a sanctified version of that. And there's a not one.
Yeah.
So, but is there any other obstacle that you've seen in generosity? I mean, that's enough of a reason. You don't have to add any more, but I just didn't want to cut you off.
Yeah. I mean, I would also say, like, I feel like we're kind of going into like the scarcity and
Abundance.
scarcity mindset. What are the two though?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's like
stewards, not owners.
Not stewards, not owners. Like prosperity gospel versus
that graph, the quadrants.
Yeah, the quadrants.
Yeah. Which I'll ask that question.
Okay.
So yeah,
Go
do you lean more toward the poverty gospel or the prosperity gospel?
There it is. That's what it was. Yeah, I definitely lean more towards the poverty gospel. And I think that is in part a reaction to like the prosperity gospel.
Sure.
And just like, I don't think that's right. You know, like I don't think if I give, 10%, God's going to be like, okay, 10 times blessings go over to you. Not that he like won't bless you, but it's like this formula.
The underlying motivation being that is just terrible. It's greed.
Yeah.
It's ironically greed.
Yeah.
If that's your motivation.
And it's like, oh yeah, I can control God if I do this thing. And so I think that is very much like, I don't think that's right. So then it goes into the poverty gospel of, and it is kind of like what I mentioned earlier, like, oh, saving and stuff. There is a part of that is kind of like, that doesn't feel right. You should rely on God, and he will provide for you, which is true. But it's also like, he's also given me the ability to save and the mindset to be able to do all those things. So I shouldn't waste that either. And so I think for a while I was just kind of going poverty gospel, was kind of more what I leaned into. But I think with the whole series on generosity, it kind of helped me see like the areas where that isn't right. Cause I was almost like, well, I feel like that's better than, prosperity gospel, or like, it's not that bad. It's up, it's on the top quadrants.
Right.
Right. So it's gotta be kind of good. But I did realize like, oh, poverty gospel and thinking that there's, that God isn't the God of abundance, that there's that scarcity, then there's the whole idea of like, there's not enough for everyone. So in order for me to do well, this person needs to do poorly. It's a zero-sum game kind of thing. And so then I realized, oh, that's not a good way to think about other people. Because then I'm like trying to push them down so that I go, up. And so that was a big realization of just like, oh, this affects how I view other people. And so I want to be able to, have that viewpoint of if somebody needs help, I'm not like, oh, that helps me give the opportunity to, I'm winning because they're losing kind of thing. Rather be like, oh, well, God's given me this, extra, this excess, and I can give that to you to help. And so I feel like that was a huge kind of thought process that I hadn't had before with the generosity series.
Yeah, I found that quadrant was really helpful for a lot of people. So I'll try to visualize it because I'm not that good at eCam to like throw it on, but it's you're either trusting God on the top of the axis and then trusting stuff, or is really actually trusting God, trusting stuff. And then the other side was abundance mentality versus scarcity. And so the poverty gospel would have been in I trust God. Like I love him. I dedicate my life to him, but I have a scarcity mentality. Like there's not enough to go around. So I got to be careful and all of that. And and so that's the helpful kind of, I forget. I mean, I made the quadrant, but I'm already forgetting. So it's poverty, prosperity, obviously the way of Jesus. Oh, and the way of the world. The way of the world is not trusting in God. It's just trusting in stuff and with the scarcity mentality, which is just a horrible way to live. And it's a way, I think it's how a lot of people are living in fear because they have that. No, that's really helpful. I have found most of our people are in the poverty gospel camp when we would have conversations. And I agree. I see the damage of prosperity gospel. It seems more damaging than the poverty gospel one, you know? So you're like, well, if I'm going to pick one, and the reality is you don't have to pick either. You know, there's another way forward, but it's hard to come up to that. So the next question I want to ask you is, how has the practice of generosity helped you confront greed in your life? Because would you even say there's any greed? Because greed is invisible. So, you know, like without really seeking counsel, this is why I think our together groups are so important, which you host and lead, because I think it takes a community of people to tell you like, hey, I'm noticing this greed in your life, you know? And, but yeah, is there ways that generosity has helped confront greed? And was there any hidden elements of greed or attachments to money and wealth that you were unaware of before committing to or continuing in your generosity practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes back to just like how I'm viewing other people, and whether they're like a threat to me or not. And so I don't think that it was like exactly like, oh, I see another person, they're a threat kind of thing. But I think that it was like a little bit of a hint of that. And I think that's still something that I probably need to work on. And then going back to kind of like the fear of the future kind of thing. That's still like a reality for me. Like, I don't know what the future holds. But in my experience, God has brought me this far and he's been faithful. And I feel like there are definitely like things that I can like point out and be like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that was God, because I needed help in that moment and help just arrived out of nowhere, it seems. So there's like examples of that in my life. And so there really isn't any reason why I should have that fear of the unknown, but I'm human and I still have that to some extent. So it's just, I think it is just like, okay, I need to trust God and be faithful with the things that he's given me. And I think that he'll be faithful too. I don't know if it's necessarily like I'm going to be a millionaire or something like that, or want to win the lottery. I don't think I'm going to win the lottery because I don't play the lottery.
Right.
But I think it is, just that needing to consistently do that. And I feel like kind of going back to that, like compound interest, I feel like just showing up every day and knowing and trusting God will help with that as time goes on, but I'm definitely not perfect with it.
In one of the books I was reading about generosity and preparing for that practice, I don't remember the name of the plant, but they were talking about the house that they got in this certain area in the country. This weed will just like almost daily spring up, and there's nothing you can do. There's no chemical that just always takes, you just have to go out every single day, pull it out, and wait for tomorrow to pull out the next one. And I think that's a great illustration to talk about greed. It's not something all of a sudden you conquered and now we moved on. To go back to what we were talking about this Sunday about Ephesians 4, this take off and put on practice. Paul wrote that in such a way where that is a never ending practice. I am always taking off bitterness and putting on forgiveness and love and compassion. You know, I'm always taking off this calloused, this fear-based mentality and putting on, you know, hope and grace and gratitude. And so I actually fear for those who say like, oh, I used to struggle, you know, with greed and now we're good. It's like, you know, the scripture's like, take heed lest you fall. Like those who think they're above it, you're probably the first one to actually cave to it. And I think of all categories of sins, and I do think there are categories where we can just experience victory. It's like, that's not a thing in my life anymore. Like I do believe in that sanctification process of us actually making progress. But it just seems the way Jesus would talk about greed, it just seems like that's one that you don't just all of a sudden, I dealt with that when I was 25 and now it's over. What's fascinating, so that was Acts chapter 19 and Ephesians 4 that we talked about this past Sunday. We're about to see in Acts chapter 20, Paul, he has this farewell to these Ephesian elders, and he goes, it's a beautiful summary of what pastors should be and do. But then he talks about greed again, and he talks about like, I have fought against this. I have made sure I'm not greedy. And I think there's something about Paul he can point to so many of the woes of life and woes of ministry, but he made sure to say, I have gone above and beyond to make sure I'm not greedy. I haven't taken advantage. And that's just one of the greatest temptations in life in general. And I think in America, there's just a level of greed that we all think is okay. You know, like you really notice it when you go to a third world country and you come back and go, wow, you know, but we've just so insulated ourselves. And that's why I was talking about the East Valley. We're so unintentionally formed by our environments. It's such an easy, and again, that's where it's hard, because I don't want to like see abundance and then have a poverty mentality. You know, when like I go to somebody's house and it's way nicer. Praise the Lord for that. I don't need it, you know, but it's a easy like, oh, how come maybe I need that better kitchen. And so all of this just requires wisdom, you know, like it's not just a right or wrong, you know, black or white in every single category.
Well, it's also like, I mean, lifestyle creep is an example of that. I feel like, as if, you know, if you get a raise or something, you're like, oh, you have more money than you had before. And then the next year you're like, I'm kind of back where I started, because you know, lifestyle creeped and you got more stuff than you needed necessarily. And so that is just a real thing. Because like when I, you know, my first job, I had, you know, I was making minimum wage, like $14 an hour. I think it was at that point or something like that. And basically, like every month I was dedicated to like, I'm going to pay off $1,000 of my student loans was kind of my thing.
It's awesome.
And so I was able to do that. And like looking back, I'm like, how was I doing that? It doesn't make any sense, because of like where I am today.
Even what you just said, minimum wage, and you're paying like what?
Yeah, like exactly. But you can figure it out if you have like certain constraints. And I think the same thing with like tithing. Like I've been tithing my entire life, so it doesn't feel like I'm able to live up to that point to where I can live off 90% of my income, and it doesn't feel weird at all.
And you say 90, and you also allocate other percentages for random blessings. So that's not even you do less than 90, but I get your point.
Yeah. Percentages. And so I can see how it can be difficult, especially if you have never tithed, to be like, you're living off of 100% and you're used to that lifestyle, to then cut 10% of that off.
Yeah.
That can be a big shift for sure.
That's actually one prayer I had, and I remember we mentioned it as one practice. Honestly, in some ways, pray the Lord gives you a raise, but don't change anything. Like, don't change your spending and your consuming. Just begin to give more. Like, what a gift that could be.
Yeah, create margin in your life. Like that's a
in
huge
general
freedom. In general, but like especially with money, like if you can create that margin, because then you can be generous, and then on top of that, you can also save for the future, so that in the future you're not having to like rely on people to like help you. You can actually bless people in your old age when you're not working anymore. I think about that too, of just like that. I like to think of like, there's an old Spencer that is a different person than me, and I'm trying to take care of him today.
Beautiful.
And so that's kind of a good way to think about saving for the future.
Let's talk about that. I was thinking about that as well. The reason, so I come from the paradigm, and I am totally fine with people at our church living off of a different paradigm, but I believe, and we talked about it. So if you're interested, go to Tithing Not Tipping sermon at formedbyjesus.com/generosity. But I'm convinced tithing is the floor, not the ceiling. And I think tithing is a wonderful practice while you're younger. And my theory is, as I get older, I'll be more generous. Right now, I have more people dependent on me, you know, with my children and trying to pay off a home and all of that. But hopefully, I'll get to the later decades of my life. And what a joy just to give way above and beyond and just bless people in incredible ways.
Yeah. Kind of going back to the money guy that I mentioned earlier, they have like, it's 9 steps, the financial order operations, but one of their ground rules is generosity is like step 0. It's every step along the way should have generosity. And that, going back to like the compound interest, if you practice that early on, then
it's a muscle.
When you get to that point where you can give a ton, that muscle has been, you know, exercised, and you're able to do it easily.
I'm
Because
glad you said it's step 0, because I've seen like people on the, and this is nothing against Ramsey. I think it's bringing a lot of freedom. But some people I talk to that do that. They're like, I'll get to giving once I'm debt free, once I've paid off, and it's like, I just think there's joy in going along the way, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's where the trust in God really comes in play. If like, okay, part of this isn't mine and I have to give it away, even though I'm in debt, you know, and all these things. Because I've also thought about, we've had
those
conversation.
discussions.
Yeah, of like, oh, well, should I just keep track of what I should have given and then give that later when I have the money to do it? Which I feel like probably isn't. I feel like that's kind of the
pay off my debts, but then keep track of what I should have, and then start doing that. Yeah,
which is also kind of like that heart posture thing.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if that's necessarily where it's a fine line. I don't think it's necessarily the best way to go about it. But yeah, because especially if later in life, if you haven't been generous and you have a lot of money, then
it has a hold on you.
Yeah, and then being generous in that fact, like say you're like a millionaire, like $100,000 giveaway, that's a lot of money. You're just going to give $100,000 away. Like, that's a big check that you're going to write. But if you've
never given away 100, it's going to be a whole lot harder to give away 100,000.
But if you're 100 and it's just $10, I can do $10.
Yeah.
Even if I only have 100, it's smaller in it, even though proportionally it's the exact same. So yeah, if you haven't exercised that, then it's going to be difficult to do that.
Yeah, man, I'm so agree to that. Let's ask this question. How has practicing generosity affected your discipleship to Jesus? Because it feels central. So in the back of our Formed by Generosity practice, it says generosity is central, not incidental to being formed by Jesus. How has that been ringing true for you in your life?
Yeah. I was thinking about this one. I feel like it helps me relate with God more. Because if I can... Because God is an abundant God, and He wants to give us blessings and such. And so when I give, it feels good to give. And so when I do that and I realize like, oh, this is actually like it feels good to do this. Why would God want to like hold back from giving me blessings? Because I feel like that's kind of where like the whole poverty gospel goes. Of like, I don't deserve this, so God shouldn't give me anything. But when you realize like, oh, it gives Him pleasure to like give to His children, that makes sense. So like having that realization that, oh, this is how God probably feels when He gives to me. Like I have that same feeling. So that's just maybe not the take that you thought that question would bring up, but I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. It helps us relate to God in that way.
Yeah. And then if you're thinking, the people listening to that, well, then how come God hasn't given me gifts? Because wouldn't He enjoy to give it to me? But I love Proverbs 20:21. It says, an inheritance gained prematurely, or some translations say too quickly, will not be blessed ultimately. Look at all the stories of the lottery winners. Like most of them like even commit suicide. Like it's just like the worst thing to happen to them. So I love to rest in that fact that if I didn't get this blessing, it's because I didn't have the maturity to withhold it, or it was gonna, who knows what kind of path it would take me down. And I know enough people in my life to see not just money, but like notoriety and fame and this and that. It's like, man, I actually don't want those things. If it leads to that, thank you, Lord, for suffering. Thank you, Lord, for withholding.
Yeah.
What a joy.
Yeah. Cause I mean, to your point, like if you win the lottery and you aren't ready for it, there's a lot of stuff that comes with it that you're not expecting, that you're not thinking about. And then that blessing can turn into something that is, a curse rather than a blessing. And, thankfully God knows all, and He's able in His wisdom to see all those things.
Yeah.
And it can lead us to be, questioning Him to some extent of like, why am I not getting this? But I guess take comfort in the fact that God knows more than us.
Yeah. And I love how Jesus is, when He was talking about that, He's like, man, don't you love to give good gifts to your children? How much more does the Father, if your child asks for bread, would you give them a rock? No, you're going to give them bread, and that's what the Father does. And even just to talk about our church corporately, we're obviously portable. And at times that's been a huge source of I don't want to go all the way to depression, but just disappointment and like, man, Lord, why not? But then as every year goes by, I'm like, oh, we weren't ready yet. Like now we're ready. And then sometimes it's like, oh no, now. So I just see how there's so many blessings that come, because honestly, a lot of churches lose their vision when a building comes into play, because then it just becomes about preserving the building. And like, there's so many blessings of actually not having one. The setup team doesn't love to hear that, and you're on that team, but
even to that point, like there is a blessing in setting up every Saturday morning.
Oh yeah.
Like the fellowship that we're like, I'm able to see these people. I'm not one to necessarily just pick up a conversation right away unless we're like doing something. And so we're doing something, and that helps lead to good conversations. And I'm able to get to know people a lot more through something like setup, even though it's like, I have to wake up early and do this, but there is a blessing in it as well. So God knows what he's doing.
Yeah. And so much of is like, the heartbeat of our church does not make attenders, but to make disciples. And I think heartbeat of consumerism would be like, setup is such a pain. But like to reframe it and go, what a joy. First of all, I get to contribute every week. You really feel like you're literally building something. And just the friendships that come from it are pretty incredible. Like that's such a tight knit group. And I think we've done a good job letting others come in, because that's always been a fear too. Like we're so close. If a new person joins the setup team, do they feel out of place? And I think we've done a good job of like, come on in and here's the things you can do. I think that's really critical. But again, I think that also points to like the money practice. Yeah, sometimes, sure, it's hard, but the rewards are just so tenfold. Like, of course I'm going to do the hard thing. And to bring it to running, because, I'm all about running right now. I said no to cinnamon rolls this morning, to the glory of God. Good job. Thank you. And I was like, Jordan, why'd you make...
I literally just talked about this.
Talked about
in front of everyone.
No, she promised it to Selah. I guess it's a Monday thing that she's been pumped about lately. And so she's like, I want to give her a joyful morning. I'm like, whatever. Anyways, running. So I started it again about a month ago because a guy, Daniel, in our church, I don't know if you've met him or get to know him much, but he just ran a half marathon and went to church that day. Pretty incredible. So we've been talking about running, and I was like, yeah, I need to get back into it. Literally the first week, I hated every day. I was like, running is the worst thing ever. And now when I wake up, I get so giddy. I'm like, I get to run, and it just takes time. And I think like you've had you're the story of that, of like, yeah, I've just budgeted for so long. It's actually, you can almost say it's like a joyful thing, right? It's at least a helpful thing. You see the benefits. You don't really feel the pain of it. But I think it's helpful to remember the beginning will be painful. But they're, again, compound. It will bring a lot of joy down the road.
Yeah, definitely agree. There can be like a barrier to entry on these things sometimes. I can't relate to running necessarily because I'm probably like, running is terrible.
But you can relate to pickleball.
Yeah. Well, pickleball is always a joy. It was never not fun.
Never a pain.
It's never a pain. But yeah, it is. You kind of hit that stride, and I'm sure there's plenty of like YouTube videos that explain the science behind that and such. But you just have to show up and do the thing.
There is even so much of a like, hey, actually in the beginning, don't overdo it. In the running, I just learned that you actually want to keep your heart rate at 150. Like anything over 150, it's not helping your muscles in the long run. And so that's been a joy for me. Like, I can't run too fast right now. I need to actually stay at this pace, and eventually I'll get faster over time. Because I do think, there's a world. I don't know what people have done with this practice, but let's just say like, okay, we're going to give 20% this month because I'm inspired to go from 0 to 20. And then all of a sudden you're in just chaos because you haven't budgeted. Now you're owed, this credit card company, all sorts of money. Like there's a way to actually overdo it in a sense. It's like what we're aiming for is more about consistency than intensity. Like what's a better win is if you budget in 3 to 5% right now and figure out what that looks like. And now we're at 7, now we're at 10, now we're just hauling, there is that intensity. I think is actually that the enemy can use that to just discourage us and burn us out quicker.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And that kind of goes back to the scripture reading thing. I feel like every time I've just tried to do it in the past, I'm like, okay, I'm going to dedicate an hour and I'm going to, have this commentary right next to it so that I can really dive into this chapter. What is Jesus really saying here? Instead of just being like, you know what? I can just read what Jesus said. And maybe I can ponder it and like think about it later, but maybe I should just read it and not have to have any like deep insight and what has everybody said about this. Just read it. And maybe I can get down to that, later down the road. But if I were to do that, I can't do that every day at this point in my life. Like I haven't set up that time. And so just showing up and reading, the chapter, minimum chapter, each day, that's my good starting point, and I can build off of that once I've established that.
Yes. And what a joy that, I'm in 1 Peter personally right now, and it talks about the varied gifts of the church and how everybody has a different gift to serve the body. And what a joy that, like, I would say, and you wouldn't say this about yourself, but you are very ahead of the game when it comes to budgeting and being generous. Like that's an easy muscle. So like, I remember I was telling you like, hey, generosity's coming up. You're like, I can't wait. Like you were like, I can't wait. Other people were like, oh, we'll see, like, oh, I don't know how bad it's going to hurt. So like there, but then, the listener could be like, man, generosity's hard, but I read 5 chapters a day in the Bible and it's easy. You're like, what a joy that we're all in different stages and ages, and different things are upstream and downstream. And I think that's the point of us doing these stories is like, hey, for some people, this is easier. Let's learn from them. For other people, the story is, man, this is really hard, but I'm really trying. And we all can just encourage each other, stir one another up towards that godly living. Is there anything else you want to end on? Is there something like, just take away something else maybe I should have asked? Maybe like I cut you off. So you're like, I was going to say this. And then
unbelievable.
You talked about running again and cinnamon rolls. So
I mean, I feel like listening to like personal finance content is a huge thing that you could do to kind of just get used to kind of these principles and such, and even get into personal finance a little bit more, and have that understanding of budgeting and all those things. Because I feel like I know all the basics at this point, but I still like listen to like The Money Guy, for example, and some other like finance
do you have
stuff.
like specific recommendations? So I've heard The Money Guy.
Money Guy.
Okay,
they're my favorite. I feel like Dave Ramsey.
Are they on YouTube?
Yeah, they're on YouTube. They do like a weekly podcast, and lots of great content from them. I'm pretty sure they're also Christian. Cool. Which is always a nice plus.
Yeah.
Dave Ramsey's good too, especially if you haven't had any background and you just like need a kick in the butt kind of thing. He sometimes is kind of mean.
Yeah. He's the challenger. He's the motivator. And
but some people need that for sure. And then he has, a whole bunch of personalities that are underneath him that, produce content as well. So those are great opportunities as well. And then, if you go to those channels, you see all the recommended stuff. There's a lot of great people out there. Graham Stephan, he's a good one as well. And a lot of their, like Graham Stephan's videos, for example, he has like a thumbnail that looks like, oh, the end is near, and like the title is terrible. And then the video is actually just like the basics again.
Pretty level-headed.
Yeah, everything's just like, well, basically, if you just keep doing this thing, the fundamentals, you'll be fine. And so it's just listening to the fundamentals and keep doing that. That's helpful, at least for me. So that you keep on track and kind of like that, with the Paul, like putting on, taking off kind of thing over and over again, and just continually showing up.
Amen. Well, what a word. Well, thank you so much for, how long do you think this was?
I have no idea.
Don't look at your clock.
2 hours.
At 1 hour and 3 minutes.
Yeah, that's not bad. We made the hour mark.
Yes. We probably could keep going, but.
Should we do like a comment this thing at the end of the video?
You pick.
The Dodgers are 2024 World Champions.
And if you don't like that, the Suns are 2025 champions. We're not
Whoa.
world. We're just
let's just stay in facts right now.
Grace and peace to you guys. Again, we encourage you to go to formed-by-jesus.com to look up at all the practices and maybe just slowly but surely start to engage in those. The one of obviously we're doing most recently is generosity, which is perfect timing for Christmas. What a wonderful time to be generous to your community, to your congregation, to your family and friends. So until next time, Jesus is better. And if you go ahead and try to leave that comment that Spencer said, let's see what happens.